Hello and welcome to the launch of the new SOAS ACE how-to guide, Navigating the Political Economy of Corruption, Observing and Understanding Active Behaviours to Inform Effective Policy. My name is Duncan Edwards and I'm the Programme Manager for the SOAS ACE programme. I'm really excited that we're able to launch this guide, which makes the SOAS ACE approach to identifying effective and realistic opportunities to reduce corruption much more accessible to those who have been working on corruption issues. I've been working in the governance and anti-corruption space for the last 15 years, and like many, have become frustrated with the relative ineffectiveness of much mainstream anti-corruption work. The SOAS ACE approach offers something different. It starts at how societies and sectors are currently operating, rather than perhaps how we might wish they were. The approach looks at the constellation of actors in a sector and their relative power, capabilities and interests to identify realistic and sustainable entry points for anti-corruption. In today's launch event, we have the following speakers: Mushtaq Khan, Executive Director of the SOAS Anti-Corruption Evidence Programme, Pallavi Roy, SOAS ACE Research Director, and Alan Hudson, who is a freelance consultant working on governance and systems change. Let me hand over to Alan now to provide a quick overview of the guide.
See lots of names, including names of people who I've not seen for many years and not been in touch with for many years. Thank you everybody for joining. Whilst her name didn't appear on the title slide, I should mention that Kathy Bain has been very involved in this process. So Kathy and I, the role that Kathy and I played was to try and tease out from the heads of Mushtaq and Pallavi the process of applying the SOAS ACE approach. So as well as providing an overview of the guide, what I've been asked to do today is to share my reflections about how the SOAS ACE approach fits within a wider landscape of efforts to understand and address complex social challenges. So that's what I'm going to do, suggesting that the SOAS ACE approach to navigating the political economy of corruption has a lot in common with other approaches to understanding and addressing complex social challenges, as well as having some distinctive points relating to power, incentives and actors' behaviours. I'm also going to suggest that the SOAS ACE process can be thought of as a learning journey that moves through a series of questions exploring the what, the so what and the now what of corruption. I wanted to include this diagram and quote on the first slide. The diagram shows that the SOAS ACE approach is primarily about a particular subset of corruption and is also about a subset of reasons for poor policy implementation. So it's primarily about policy distorting corruption, the overlap between those two things. The quote is taken from the first paragraph of the executive summary. I wanted to highlight it and I bolded those words because I think they're very important. And they emphasize that when you're thinking about policy distorting corruption, and indeed corruption of other types, you're really looking at a number of things: power, a multiplicity of actors, resources, interests, including vested interests, and incentives. So taking all of those things together, what you're looking at is relative power and capabilities of interests of a multiplicity of actors in a dynamic system. So moving on to the next slide, please. So as some of you will know, I've worked, my focus has been on governance and anti-corruption in the global development space for the last 25, maybe 30 years. And over that time, my approach and my thinking has evolved over time. 12 years ago, I was very much a champion of transparency and accountability. Over the years since then, I've kind of, my approach and thinking has evolved a bit, and certainly over the last 2.5 years when I've been freelancing, has very much focused on understanding and addressing complex social challenges. So what are complex social challenges? Complex social challenges are challenges that are held in place and persist, but also evolve as a result of actors, the behaviour of those actors, the relationships and interactions amongst those actors, all of which takes place in a landscape of emergent patterns. The implication of this is that change is non-linear, uncertain, emergent, driven by the behaviour of actors in relationships in particular contexts and landscapes. The diagram on the right is a representation of complex adaptive systems or complex social systems taken from the work of Glenda Ouyang on human systems dynamics. So in my explorations, particularly over the last 2.5 years, of different approaches to understanding and addressing complex social challenges, I've explored and engaged with a lot of different initiatives. And what I've noticed is that many of these initiatives are very strong in terms of thinking about emergent learning, collaborative sense making, and adaptive action. But a number of initiatives and approaches to addressing complex social challenges are relatively weak on power, incentives, and actors' behaviours. Or put another way, they can be relatively weak and nebulous in terms of thinking about causality. And this means that because of this, there can sometimes be inadequate diagnosis of the challenges, of the focus challenges, unrealistic design of approaches to address those challenges, and therefore ineffective approaches and ineffective policies. I think corruption is quite clearly a critical case for taking account of power and incentives. Power and incentives are really at the core of corruption, and so approaches to addressing and understanding and addressing corruption really need to have power and incentives at their core. Next slide. So what's interesting to me about the SOAS ACE approach is that it sees corruption as something that emerges from complex social systems of corruption. And it offers an approach to understanding and addressing complex social challenges that is aligned with an understanding of how change happens in complex social systems. It searches for entry points and crafts solutions that are potentially impactful and politically feasible. It takes a systemic and relational approach to understanding actors' behaviours and designing policies that are informed by that understanding. And it considers actors' characteristics, behaviours and relationships in a landscape of power and incentives, which is shaped by and in turn shapes actors' behaviours. Next slide. So then I just want to say something about what I think is the core of the SOAS ACE approach. And in effect, I'm saying that the core of the SOAS ACE approach is a process of navigation. So what is this process of navigation? As the report makes clear, there are kind of three key elements of the SOAS ACE approach, and I kind of see these as elements that are needed for effective navigation in a complex social landscape. So firstly, observing patterns of behaviour around a flow of policy resources. In effect, this is the what question, what's going on. Then secondly, analysing and understanding how contextual and relational factors drive actors' behaviours, particularly at sites of positive deviance where there is more rule following and less corruption than you might expect. This is a so what question. And then thirdly, crafting policy proposals that use that understanding to target particular actors and entry points with tailored policies that incentivize behavior change that can enhance and extend, or in other cases, enable rule following behavior. So that's the now what. So for me, what this then points to is a way of thinking about complex social challenges, including corruption, which is in effect a process of pattern spotting for positive deviance, and then understanding the political economy of positive deviance and pockets of effectiveness to inform approaches to address complex social challenges. Final slide, please, Duncan. So as I hope many of you have seen from looking through the how-to guide, chapter 1 introduces and talks about the key elements of the SOAS ACE approach: observing, analysing and crafting. Chapter 2 talks about what approach does SOAS ACE take and why. This outlines the political settlements framing and the understanding of the dynamics of social change that is at the core of the SOAS ACE approach. Chapter 3 talks about putting the SOAS ACE approach into practice. Here, particularly in terms of the phases of the research process, the research analysis process, and the strategies that might be suitable for different sorts of contexts and configurations of actors. Chapters 4 and 5 are the case studies from Bangladesh and from Nigeria, which include some excellent actor-based systems maps done by Liddy Greenaway. And chapter 6 is a kind of forward-looking agenda for collaborative learning to enhance impact and collaborative learning amongst different approaches to address complex social challenges. I think and I hope that the how-to guide adds some value to previous publications. Hopefully it's relatively accessible It's reasonably clear, including with by identifying the observing, analysing and crafting as key elements of the process. The way it sets out the phases of the research process and the questions that one might explore, the diagrams and maps, the case studies and the future agenda, I hope make the how-to guide a useful addition to the work that SOAS ACE has done over the years. And with that, I will pass back to Duncan, please.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alan. Thanks for that introduction. With that, I'm going to hand over to Mushtaq Khan. If you want to unmute yourself, Mushtaq, and I'll move the slides onto your introduction to the SOAS ACE approach.
Thank you, Duncan, and thank you, Alan. So I think what this guide tries to do is to set out what we do in our heads so that people can follow the different steps. Because when we write our papers, we don't put a lot of the methods in the papers, but we are following a method in getting to the conclusion. So I think that's what the aim of this how-to guide is. Now I want to begin a step before. Many of you are well aware of the SOAS ACE approach, but a central part of the arguments in all of our research is this distinction between vertical enforcement and horizontal checks. So let me just remind people of this, and I'll move on to some of the issues that Alan touched on in a little bit more detail. So when we normally think about anti-corruption, we are thinking of an enforcer, like the Anti-Corruption Commission or the police or the courts or voters if they're looking at politicians. And then you have the corrupt actors, the bureaucrats, the businessmen, and so on, who are breaking some rules or regulations for their own benefit and exercising their power. Vertical enforcement, that line going from top to bottom, refers to that process of formal anti-corruption. It's looking at transparency processes. How do we collect information of who's violating what rule? It's looking at accountability processes. How do we then use this information to prosecute, to punish, to remove from positions people who are corrupt? And then we are looking at the technical capacities of the enforcers. Do they have the right computing equipment, the right systems, the right digital apparatus, et cetera, et cetera? And those things, that's our starting point, work in some contexts and absolutely don't seem to work in other contexts. And our starting point is to say, is that what we are ignoring is the system behind that particular activity. Because behind that activity is a lot of stuff going on, which we take for granted if you're in an advanced country with a rule of law. And very simply, what we are ignoring is that there are plenty of other actors, and we call them horizontal actors, simply because they're not part of this vertical chain, who are looking at what the enforcers are doing and what the corrupt actors are doing, and then either supporting or obstructing that enforcement process, right? So those are what we call the horizontal actors. And sometimes these horizontal actors are checking. So checking means that they're doing something which is helping the anti-corruption activity. You know, at other times, they might be obstructing the anti-corruption activity. Those horizontal actors could be, in the case of the checks on the enforcers, they could be other government departments, they could be political parties, they could be the media, they could be powerful businesses who put pressure on the enforcers saying, if you don't do your job properly, we will remove you. And if you need support from us, here is the support that you need. Without that horizontal support, anti-corruption enforcers often, even with all the transparency, accountability, and other systems in place, often sit and do nothing. They might go after the wrong targets deliberately, all that stuff that we know very well, or just do nothing. And in many cases, the horizontal actors actually prevent the enforcers from working by obstructing their activity. In the same way, the corrupt actors, the bureaucrats, businesses, and so on at the bottom, aren't going to simply respond to attempts at correcting their behavior or punishing them if they are not under pressure from other actors, like their peers, the people they transact with, their employers or their employees. So what happens in rule of law countries is that those horizontal actors say, now that your corruption has been detected, we will stop transacting with you, we might fire you, we might put pressure on the government to do something about you, unless you correct. So those horizontal pressures both at the level of the corrupt actors and at the level of the enforcers are critical in our view. This is the systemic analysis that is often missing. Now, the most usual way in which the systemic analysis is brought in is to look at social norms. So people say the behavior of these enforcers and the corrupt actors depend on how they think other people expect them to behave. And so there's a whole literature on social norms and expectations of behavior, which we don't think is wrong, but we think that it doesn't go far enough. Because where do those expectations come from? Where do those beliefs come from about the behavior of other people? It comes from, and this is the heart of the SOAS ACE approach, it comes from the power and interests of the horizontal actors. So we have to look at why they are either supporting or not supporting enforcement activities at different levels. So if you go to the next slide, Duncan, please. So then, and we call this the PCI approach, power, capabilities, and interests. So let me just quickly remind you of what this means and why it's so important to our approach in creating this picture of the systemic process in which that particular corruption that we're looking at is embedded. Power reflects to the ability of actors, horizontal or vertical, to block other actors who might be acting against their interests. So when we talk about power, we are not talking about the most powerful people in the country. We are saying, have we identified people of sufficient power to block the people who are violating a particular rule? And if not, actually the anti-corruption isn't going to work. The second key feature is our definition of productive capabilities. And this is possibly the bit of our analysis that most people, most of the time, misunderstand. When we talk about capabilities, we are not talking about technical capacities, like do you have a computer system, do you have the cars to chase the corrupt people, and so on. We mean by productive capabilities a description of how people make a living. And productive capabilities refers to activities through which people make a living by adding value for others. Now, adding value for others doesn't mean production of widgets and grain and so on. You can add value in sports, you can add value in culture, you can add value in media. Perhaps you can also add value in universities. It remains to be seen, but we think we are adding value. Now, if you're adding value, if a group of people are adding value, then to organize that activity, you need formal rules. You need rules to organize your activity and to transact with others. In general, a bunch of people who are adding value productively support rules, even if they might want to violate a few rules secretly. If as soon as they detect others are violating rules, they will be out there saying the rules have to be enforced because their entire business model collapses without rules. In contrast, groups that make their living by extracting from others, a bad football team bribes to get higher up the league, an orchestra that doesn't play wants to make money by building the concert hall, not by playing its music. A business that is not very productive wants to make money by borrowing money from banks and not repaying it, and so on. So if the group doesn't have productive capabilities, it's likely that it's not going to be that interested in enforcing rules either on themselves or others. And the third thing is that even if an actor has productive capabilities and power, they still might not have an interest in stopping corruption if they can form collusive coalitions and share in the corruption. So the numbers of people are important because it's a collective action of the collusive group. If there's only one productive actor and they're very powerful, it doesn't mean they will want to enforce the rules. They will find it easier to collude and steal from the public. But if there are 10 powerful actors and all of them are productive and they're competing, then you are more likely to end up with a situation where individually they support rules. Now, so the first thing that we do is map the distribution of power, capabilities, and interests at the different levels which are relevant for our problem. So we begin at a very broad national or even sometimes global level understanding what are the actors relevant for the problem we are looking at. But the bulk of our work is at the sectoral and policy level, where we go into the understanding of the PCI in great detail, and that's what the case studies will later do, show you how we do that at that level. Next slide, please. Now, coming back to Alan's point about policy distorting corruption, this is a really important point because there are many types of corruption. Policy distorting corruption refers to the corruption that results in sustained losses of public resources in important policy areas like health, education, and so on. The sustained part of it is really important. We're not talking of one-off thefts and hit and run exercises in corruption, which are also there. This is where your whole education system is running for years and years on end, and the money you're spending isn't resulting in better educational outcomes. This is a sustained loss of resources. And when you have these kinds of sustained failures, the loss is persistent because the power, capabilities, and interests of both horizontal and vertical actors are allowing this diversion and wastage to happen. Diversion is easy to understand. So policy resources going for education don't go to education. They're stolen or diverted in other uses. But wastage is also a form of corruption. So a lot of our work, for example, is on absenteeism of health workers. So they're taking a salary from the government, but they're not in the hospital. Or a teacher is getting a salary, they're not in the school. That is also a corruption. So when you're unable to block these activities, either of diversion or of wastage, it is a PCI problem at some level. And we are trying to figure out what's going on before we offer a solution. Why do we focus on policy distorting corruption? Firstly, because it has a huge impact on society and development, but also in many cases, someone is saying sound is cut off. Duncan, can you please check that everyone can hear? But we also think that policy distorting corruption is feasible to attack in many cases because the PCI configuration allows us to intervene. This is critically important. The reason why we focus here is not only because it has a huge impact, but because there are many areas of policy distorting corruption which it is feasible to attack. And we will talk about how we identify these entry points in the case studies. We'll also talk about a number of different strategies. That's Pallavi's, it'll come on immediately after this, talking about a number of strategies where we use the PCI approach to find how we can identify sufficient horizontal checks to address a particular type of corruption. The point to make here is that we are well aware that there are many other types of corruption that people are interested in. There's political corruption, there's predatory corruption, there's all types of corruption. Those also will only work if you have sufficient horizontal checks. But those horizontal checks are much more difficult to design because you're talking about political settlements where the overall distribution of power in that society is not amenable to that right now. So the only way you will address those political corruption, predatory corruption type problems is if you first develop the productive capabilities and the distribution of power in that direction. That is our theory of change. And so we do that by looking at these policy blockages. We can come back to this. That doesn't mean that there are not things you can do about political corruption. I'm sitting in Bangladesh now where we are dealing with the legacy of problems created by previous political corruption and predatory corruption. And you need to fight that. And to fight that, you also have to look at horizontal checks. But these are exceptional circumstances. And in the normal circumstances, we don't think that there are feasible approaches to these problems which deliver quick results. I'll stop there and move on to Pallavi, who will talk us through the 3 different strategies which evolve out of different assessments of how feasible it is to develop horizontal checks. Over to you.
Thank you, Mushtaq. Thank you very much. Duncan, maybe have the next slide. Thank you so much. So as Mushtaq outlined, depending on the configuration of the power, capabilities, and interests that we observe of the actors within a particular activity or a sector that we are tracking, we home in on policy design that features one of the 3 strategies. And the common feature running across these policy designs are the presence of effective horizontal enforcement or the lack thereof. That's the one broad common factor. But how we look for it and what we do if it is not there is what differentiates the 3 strategies. And the first one is enhancing effective checks. The second one we call creating effective checks when otherwise we cannot identify horizontal checks that we can actually facilitate and encourage in terms of rule following behavior. And the third one is when you have no identifiable effective horizontal checks. And the word effective is important, that it's sustained, it's across a group of people. The collective action problem is really not a collective action problem anymore. You solve the free riding problem actually. And when that doesn't exist, we call it the mitigation and transformation problem. Maybe have the next slide, Duncan. Thank you. So what happens here? The first step in this strategy, which we call creating effective checks, is to look for evidence that some effective horizontal checks are already actually happening. And the second step is to assess why some actors are engaged in this effective checking. That gives us an opening into understanding whether there is a feasible and an impactful entry point into anti-corruption over here. And finally, we investigate if this behavior can be extended or enhanced to other actors using feasible changes in policy. Next slide. And we'll go into this a little deeper. What do we mean by this? So here, what we are essentially looking for are similar actors who are confronted with similar rules or institutions and policies, but they're actually behaving very differently. So we have similar actors, identical actors subject to the same formal rules and incentives, and are behaving differently, with some operating with higher levels of corruption and others operating with lower levels of corruption. And this is really an indicator for us, a very encouraging indicator for us, because if there is a difference in behavior, this actually signals that the low corruption actors are in relationships with other actors who have the interest and power to curtail rule distorting behavior. And these actors are actually pressuring them to follow rules. But in contrast, the actors that are engaging more corruption are actually not being pressured or influenced to follow the rules. So this becomes very important for us to identify. And then the next step is for us to investigate if there are differences in the characteristics of the actors that can actually explain these differences in peer-driven checking. What is it in the set of one actors? What kind of feature is making them being rule following? So that's something that we identify. And once we do that, we gather evidence for whether the characteristics that generate this horizontal checking can actually be expanded. And Mushtaq will be talking about this in greater detail when he talks about the Bangladesh case study. But this is very, very grounded in observational. We look for existing evidence once we found that there are actually evidences of rule following behavior, which we think can be feasibly expanded, right? And this takes us to the next strategy, where we are, next slide please, Duncan, where we are actually confronted with a situation where there are absolutely no positive deviations. We can see that there is a lot of rule violation going on. We do not see these differences in behavior, but what we see is that there may be opportunities to create checks that can actually lead us to rule following behavior. And when we say that there are opportunities to create checks, what do we mean by them? The next step here for this strategy, what's very important here, therefore, is to see, well, why are people being corrupt? In the first, we look for differences in behavior, that somebody's behaving in a rule-following manner, somebody's not behaving in a rule-following manner. Well, we say, well, that's not available to us here because we don't find evidence of that. We don't observe evidence of that. In the second case, it is to then understand, well, what is it that makes people corrupt? And, it's not always greed and discretion and tarring everybody with the same brush. We actually sometimes see, and this is the first between you and the 45 out there, basically, it's that we then divide rule following or rule violating behavior into reasonable reasons for corruption or unreasonable reasons for corruption. And what do we mean by reasonable reasons for corruption? That an actor is being corrupt or violating rules because she or he does not have a choice. This depends on her or his livelihood. There are other vulnerabilities that this person is exposed to. So he really doesn't have a choice but to be corrupt. But in the other case, there are people who can be rule following. It's well within their power and capabilities to be rule following, but they simply can't. And these are who we call the free riders or the extractors in this case. And these are the actors who are becoming corrupt for unreasonable reasons. And then we ask if there are policies or horizontal checks that can actually help those who are forced to break the rules to become compliant. So we take a step further. Can we actually identify policies which actually plugs that gap, that makes that reasonable reason become a rule follower, right? The next slide, please. So, and we will be giving examples of this. The Nigeria case study that will come up very soon is a good example of this. So what happens is once we've created that policy, which helps other people follow rules, corruption is directly reduced because you have a large number of people who are then becoming rule following. And then the free riders and extractors in this case come under pressure. So you're creating an opportunity to go back to strategy one, which is then can you enhance that check? Can you create the pressure so that the free riders and extractors then feel forced or are forced to then start following rules? And here something like a strategy one would work. But before that, we have to create that enabling circumstance, which is creating that policy which lets you become rule following. And then welfare is not reduced, and this is extremely important because a lot of the transparency and accountability kind of reforms actually suppose that everybody's being corrupt or violating rules for the same reason, but that's not the case. We really need to pass through why that is happening. And so therefore welfare is not reduced by forcing compliance on the weak. Sometimes people aren't able to, sometimes if people did, you would actually be hitting on their livelihoods, as we will see in the case of the SMEs in Nigeria. So this strategy 2 actually takes care of this very important problem, unintended consequence of doing anti-corruption. Next slide, please, Duncan. And this sometimes tends to get overlooked. People get very excited about strategy 1 and strategy 2, which is creating, and we'll come back to it. Gets dismissed because, as I said, people get excited about, oh, there's something that we can do. This is great. Strategy 3, which is mitigation and transformation strategies, is what we recommend and what ourselves have researched and worked on and evidenced in SOAS ACE, happens when you really don't see an exit option through strategy 1 or strategy 3, where corruption is so intractable. And this is the point at which you say, oh my God, this is all hopeless and we give up and there's nothing we can do, let's walk. But we say, no, that's really not what one needs to do here, because this is exactly the sector or the activity which needs our attention. But how does it need our attention if we cannot create strategy 1 or strategy 2 here? But first, it's important to understand what context we are talking about. And here we identified 2 concepts that we researched in SOAS ACE. One is network corruption, which is that effective horizontal checks are completely absent because mostly, in all cases, 99% of the actors are collusively breaking rules. It might not be a very explicit collusion, but it could be implicit collusion. Everyone is sharing rents. And there is also hierarchy of benefits. The gains are differential. Somebody gains a lot more than someone else, but everybody is gaining quite significantly from rule breaking. It's much more in your interest to be rule violating than from following the rules. And this was something that we saw in the Niger Delta work that we did in Nigeria. Next slide, please. So here, the policy implication is that there is no immediate anti-corruption strategy based on strategy 1 and strategy 2. So our policy is quite unconventional, which is you mitigate the immediate consequence, harmful outcome of that corruption. When we were looking at the Niger Delta, we actually saw that there were environmental consequences, there were health consequences. Is there some immediate way to investigate that and mitigate that? Some policy which takes care of the environmental hazards, some policy which takes care of the COPD that results from breathing in hazardous air, and we can talk to it later in the Q&A session. And the medium and long-term strategy then is the transformation strategy, which is essentially about livelihoods which allow you to be rule following rather than being rule breaking in this hierarchy of benefits way. But we can talk to these in the Q&A sessions. We will move on to the case studies now. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. We've had quite a lot of talking from SOAS ACE up to now. I'd just like to open the floor briefly to see if there's any kind of questions or reflections from those on the call. in terms of managing a room of almost 50 people, could people drop questions or comments in the chat, or if you raise your hand, I'll invite you to come in with a question or response. Anyone? Any appetite? Hi, Tom. Do you want to come in with a question?
Yeah, thanks, Duncan. For some reason, I can't get the chat to work, so I can't see what people are commenting. But just a quick reaction. I mean, I think this is such a good initiative. So hats off to Alan and Kathy for doing kind of like a accessible how-to note guide, because I think it's really important to be able to take this really deep thinking and be able to translate it into something which ordinary pea-brains, practical people like me can actually use. So it's a really exciting, really important initiative. So that's one point. And then I guess the second one is that, I mean, if there are, foundations on the call, if there are donor representatives on the call, just the importance of really investing in this approach, because we know that the incentive systems that we have as donors or implementing partners don't allow this kind of depth, that kind of economic ethnography that you talk about. It's not easy to find the space to actually do this work properly, but the implication of your work is that you'll get far better outcomes, much greater value for money by applying this kind of an approach. And so there's an urgent need to kind of invest in applying the approach and coming with practical solutions and then seeing what the outcome is, so that you can directly compare it to kind of the orthodox conventional approach to policy distorting corruption, so people can see really clearly the benefits. So that's the two comments I wanted to make, and then I'll save a question for later. But thanks, it was absolutely brilliant. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. Lucio, you put a comment in the chat. Do you want to come in on that? You raised an interesting example of where this might be potentially relevant in Colombia.
Hi, Duncan. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for these great ideas. No, I was just curious about, I mean, Colombia is quite an extreme context where corruption many times is forced by violent actors, forcing people who want to do the right thing to be corrupt. Judges, government officials, policemen, etc. So my question always when I see something like this, and this framework looks really great, but I'm testing it against the Colombian context and whether this framework can deal with those violent pressures. So when I saw the idea of the reasonable, what was that? The reasonable rationale, or
reasonable reason.
Yes, exactly. That clicked with me. So I just wanted to explore a little bit more about that. But I know time is limited, so I'll let you guys continue, because I'm interested in listening to the next case study, which sounds really exciting as well. For the moment, just thank you so much, because this framework really illuminates and provides new categories of thinking to come up with new strategies or different strategies. And I love the emphasis on systems thinking and complexity as well. So thank you so much, guys.
Okay, brilliant. All right. Well, let's use that as a segue to move on to the case studies. Mushtaq, do you want to talk about Bangladesh first off?
Yes, but just to respond to the last question, I think that what the PCI framework does is, even when people are being forced to be corrupt and they have no reasonable way of surviving without being corrupt, we can't address all of those problems. So I suppose, when judges and so on are forcing people, that's a very tough problem. But what we do is we say, let's begin with the solvable problems first, because there's a lot of lower level problems which are solvable. And we are very much incrementalists. We think that you have to work with what is feasible to it. And as you show success, reality might start changing. Because if you begin with very difficult problems and you can't solve them, it actually is counterproductive. So I'll just stop there, and we'll give an example of these reasonable reasons from the Nigerian case study that Pallavi will come out with. So let me begin. Duncan, first slide. So what do we want to show you through the case studies is what we try to achieve in our research. The first thing is that we try to identify evidence-based anti-corruption strategies that can sustainably improve social outcomes. And this sustainable is linked to this policy distorting part of the story. We begin by first identifying sectors and policies which are important for that country. So we need to understand the country and its history. Why do we select this sector and that policy in Bangladesh and not in Nigeria? Is because we understand our countries. Then we look at the flow of resources that are going through from the top to the bottom in the policy flow chart. And we identify all the actors who are trying to affect this flow in their own interest in ethnographic detail. In other words, what we do is we send our researchers who look like and sound like the people who are being observed. In other words, not me, but we recruit people who might be quite innocuous in looking at how decisions are being made on an everyday basis in the problems that we are trying to understand. We train them, obviously, but from that, we build up an understanding of how actors are actually behaving in trying to influence the flow of resources in the direction they want. And that's a really critical part of our work, and we spend a lot of time doing that. From that, we deduce the power, capabilities, and interests of actors by observing their behavior, not asking them, do you have an interest in fighting corruption? Not asking them, are you a really productive actor and are you hurt by corruption? We just observe their behavior and deduce their power, capabilities, and interests. Then, and only then, we come to a hypothesis. And the hypothesis is that policy X will trigger a sustainable improvement in outcomes because it will trigger that kind of horizontal checking activity, which the right PCI to block the thing that we are trying to block. Okay, so for most economists and social scientists, devising the hypothesis takes about 5% of the time, and they spend 95% of the time testing the hypothesis with very high-tech techniques. For us, at least 60 or 70% of the time is spent identifying the hypothesis that we think will be a sustainable improvement. And this is one of the real problems we have with RCTs and so on. Even if you can show an experiment that achieves an improvement, you don't know if it is sustainable. Is it going to last over time? You only have a hunch that it will last over time if you can see that it will trigger the PCI of local actors who will, in their own interest, make it work over time. That is why before you test something, you should know that it's worth testing. Otherwise, you spend $2 million testing something, and you might have a small size effect, but it's really not worth it because 6 months later, it will disappear. Then finally, we should say that our work simply stops at this stage. As a research body, we are identifying policy ideas that, if implemented, we think on the basis of evidence would be sustainable. But we are not an implementation agency which is actually doing it. And this has been a serious problem. When we go with these ideas to the implementation people, to the programs of development partners, to country offices or to governments, there is a PCI problem in getting that adopted. There is a PCI problem in ensuring that people with the right power, capabilities, and interests follow this through to the implementation. All that we are saying is if it was implemented, it's a very high likelihood that it would work. So one of the things that we are looking for, and we have been trying, Tom, who spoke earlier, knows our attempts in Nepal, to take these ideas embedded into the policy implementation and design process. But so far, we haven't been successful because a lot of money is required to take these ideas into actual implementation. We'll come back to that in the conversation later on. But just to make it clear that what we are talking about is identifying a policy that may work were it to be implemented. Okay, next slide, Duncan. So the first example that we are giving is one of strategy 1. it's about enhancing effective checks. This is a research that we did on embankment and cyclone shelter building in Bangladesh. It's a low-lying country with a lot of investment in climate adaptation infrastructure and massive corruption in this infrastructure. 20 to 30% of the policy resources get diverted and wasted. We know this from the work of Transparency International, who was our research partner in this project. But some embankments, like the one you are seeing in the picture, are properly built, and many others are badly built. So why are some embankments and cyclone shelters suffering from lower corruption in their building and others not? So the first step is to understand the policy resource flow. So next slide, Duncan. So we begin by first understanding. Now, you're not going to see this very clearly in this slideshow, but it's in your in the document. I'm just quickly saying what is the document trying to do. So when you read it, or if you haven't read it yet, when you read it, it'll make more sense. So the first step in our research is to understand the flow of resources right from the finance ministry down to the local construction actors who are engaged in making the embankment or the cyclone shelter. Second slide. Once we have the policy resource flow, we then look at all the places where the leakages are happening and why are they happening. Okay, so in this case, leakages are happening, and in most cases in developing countries, at multiple levels. Some resources are lost at the ministry level, some resources are lost at the contracting level, some resources right down at the local government level where the embankments are being built. Okay? The reason why we need to understand this is that it might not be feasible to block all of this at the same time instantly. Our approach is to find the most effective entry point where a policy will make a big enough difference so that you see a policy outcome difference. That's the goal. But to do that, we need to understand the whole scale of the problem from top to bottom and why is it happening. Next slide. This is the really important part of the story. The really important part of the story is what we call economic ethnography, where our local knowledge of the political settlement and the configuration of power is combined with well-trained research partners who go and observe behavior of both the vertical and the horizontal actors at different levels and how they are acting or not acting to stop the corruption. This is the really, really intense part of the research. And what we find is that in many of these outflows, many of these leakages, the horizontal actors either do not have the power to stop it, or they don't have the interest to stop it because they're also beneficiaries. And many of the actors on whom a lot of money is spent, resources are spent as watchdogs and as anti-corruption partners, are actually very ineffective. So for example, NGOs observing these flows are usually extremely ineffective because they have no sustained power to block these outflows. They have power only as long as the funding is coming, and everybody knows that, so they just wait for the NGO to move on to the next project. NGOs very rarely have a sustained impact on anti-corruption at the local levels in the kinds of countries that we study. Similarly, media and opposition parties have very little horizontal effect. But to cut a long story short, this kind of observation identified an actor who unexpectedly had an impact as a horizontal checking actor, which did reduce corruption, and that is directly connected with the embankments and so on that are well made. And these are locally influential actors. Influential means, our definition was that they have more than the average amount of land in the locality. These are very poor localities, so someone who has more than the average amount of land is still a very poor person. But these people are locally influential. They have local power to block contractors who are stealing excessive amounts of resources. Some of these actors occasionally have a real interest in the quality of the infrastructure but only if the infrastructure, the embankment or the cyclone shelter, has a dual use. That is, the embankment can be used as a road, or the cyclone shelter can be used as a school or a community center, which is immediately of interest to that influential actor. And in those cases, those influential actors informally come out to observe the quality of construction, and magically, the quality of construction improves. This is just observation. Okay. Now, from that observation, we constructed a hypothesis that we then test. So the next slide. The hypothesis testing part of it can take various forms. We develop a hypothesis, and in this case, the hypothesis is that those climate adaptation projects which had a stronger dual use ended up with lower corruption and better construction compared to others which had weaker dual use. Now, the dual use is not planned, although the rules in Bangladesh say that all climate adaptation projects should have dual use. In practice, they're not tested for their dual use. Now, all these embankments can be made and can be used as roads. All cyclone shelters can be used as community centers, but it depends critically where they are built. Now, where they are built is normally not up to the community, is determined randomly by the state. And what we showed is that when randomly they are built in a place where it is of use to the local community, corruption declines. From that follows, so this we showed with evidence and a big survey and so on, and that's the published paper. A policy outcome that comes from that is if you want to help the vertical actors do their anti-corruption, you must create that horizontal pressure on them. And that horizontal pressure on them comes when, if you deliberately design these embankment and cyclone shelter projects so that they maximize the dual use at the local level, that triggers the horizontal check, that reduces the corruption. And how do you do that? By having several designs of the location of these projects and letting the local community select the one that is most used to the local community. And that we hypothesize from our testing is the most effective way of creating the horizontal checks, given the whole analysis of the process chain. That's the point at which we found you can actually make an immediate impact. So there's a question about, let me just quickly answer the question about what about project where the waste is not seen by communities. Yeah, so I think that this is very specific to a particular kind of infrastructure. It will not work for other types of infrastructure. But whatever type of infrastructure you are developing, you need to do that process analysis, you need to do your observation, and then you need to figure out what is the most effective way of entering it. We are not at all suggesting, and this is a really good point, that this method can be transplanted to some other country or to some other time. I'll stop there, and then Pallavi will now give an example of strategy 2 from Nigeria.
Oops, I was on mute. Okay, so this is Nigeria. I'm going to, since Mushtaq has laid the framework for it, you are familiar with the kind of ethnography that we do. So the first slide really lays out the resource flows. And as you can see on paper, it looks very robust, lots of touch points for monitoring and accountability and transparency. And if things work well in this system, you would have the right kind of electricity being produced and transmitted and distributed to the kind of people who need it as and when, right? But this is not what exists in reality. Next slide, please. So here again, we have the resource flows and where the resources are leaking out from. And the Nigerian power sector is particularly problematic because it is unfortunately a fairly dysfunctional sector. It's become better over the last couple of years, but at the time that we were studying it, starting on from 2016, 2017, this was not the kind of big ticket successful privatization that the country had hoped for. We had already seen a fairly successful telecoms privatization, but the electricity privatization just did not work for them. the country at the time of privatization was producing about evacuating about 4,500 megawatts of electricity. It's pretty much in that same ballpark, gone up to about 5,500. And yes, there are a lot of technical problems, there are transmission problems, but beyond a doubt, corruption issues are a huge problem, and they start from across all levels of activities in the sector. It starts from politically connected players who have actually taken ownership of electricity generation companies and distribution companies. It also ends with consumers simply refusing to pay their bills because they very reasonably say that I get just 4 to 5 hours of electricity. I'm not bothered. I won't just pay my electricity bill. You can do what you want. You can disconnect, but I barely get any electricity. So there is that rational, reasonable reason, and this is where we come to a reasonable reason. It does sound like rule violating behavior and serious rule violating behavior, but this is if you were a residential consumer, a poorer residential consumer, or an SME, then this is actually reasonable behavior on your part. And the formal vertical enforcement does not work because there are high levels of political corruption and policy distorting corruption here. So the moment other investors who are technically capable see that what you need to succeed in this sector are political connections, not as much your technical capabilities, they vote with their feet and simply stop investing in the sector. So it's a bit of a whammy across all levels in the Nigerian electricity generation sector. Next slide, please. Right. So what we were looking for here, very similarly, is what then, given that it seems that there are these huge numbers of rule violation, and at no level do we see any rule following behavior. Well, could we identify reasons for why people were violating rules, whether it was non-payment of bills, whether it was actually stealing electricity? It's called hooking for those of you who work on the electricity sector in developing countries. And that's one big reason why people actually violate rules in that sector. And at the other level, as I said, there is a lot of political corruption going on here. But at the level of where there were reasonable reasons for corruption, the one segment that we zeroed in on were SMEs. And I'm going to speed up here. We can talk about it in the questions later. Were the SMEs, and why did we think that this was a segment that we could actually work with in terms of improving their behavior and make it more fulfilling? The first is they are violating for a very reasonable reason, which is most SMEs. And when the first Nigerian Bureau of Statistics survey came out in 2013, they were getting 4 to 5 hours of electricity. They're still getting 4 to 5 hours of electricity. Meanwhile, costs have gone up, inflation has gone up. Their profit margins are really, really being harmed. And so for them, it's just the right thing to do, But they also are fairly desperate for electricity, and they're willing to pay for it, and they have the capability to pay for it. And here we are looking at SME clusters. We're not just looking at any SME which has grown up, as a corner shop. We're looking at SME clusters because most of the SMEs have similar relative power. So if they are going to be checking each other, no one's higher in any kind of hierarchy. There's an equality there. They're as powerful. They're as capable. They all want to follow the rules and get electricity. So if we were to give them a solution which provides them the quality and kind of electricity that they're looking for, they're more than happy to pay for it. And they're also more than happy to monitor the peer who is equal in terms of power and capability. They have that interest to monitor the peer and make sure that he, in this case, it's always a he, is also paying their electricity bill. So we actually hypothesize that with the right kind of governance mechanism, this is simple to say that, yes, this is happening, but the real testing of this hypothesis happens in the evidence generation. So what we did, and next slide, Duncan. And so what we really did was we first tried to set up a pilot. There wasn't funding available for it. So we did the next best thing, and it was a really exciting opportunity to actually conduct a lab in the field experiment. We worked with an SME cluster in Abuja. We provided them with different scenarios, contractual scenarios, whether it was joint liability, single contracts, other kinds of shared responsibility contracts, and compared them with the kind of payment behavior, rule following behavior in terms of bills. And we are in the process going through those, of finalizing those results, but it's very clear that mechanisms for horizontal enforcement have actually had positive replies. That yes, if there is this kind of a horizontal contractual mechanism, we will actually end up paying our bills if we are assured that we will be given our electricity. So we will use this bit of lab in the field evidence to then take to investors so that we can now actually set up the pilot. But I'm going to stop here because we really do want your questions, and we can already see there's a lot on chat. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks a lot, Pallavi. Thanks a lot, Mushtaq. And thanks a lot, Alan, for your input. So I think there's quite a lot of questions in the chat. And I just wanted to call on Celia. You had an interesting question to ask around natural resource governance. Would you like to come in with that question?
Oh, yes, thanks. Thank you for your fascinating presentation so far. I think my question actually is more about definitions, and I'm missing what you mean by corruption. Sorry, I know you've probably gone around this a million times in your team, and what you're meaning by rules, because certainly in my sectors, those two things are not necessarily bad and they're not necessarily good. I think you've referred to that in terms of some of the nuances you've made, but I think for me that's what my question was about, the way in which rules, in the uncertainty of these sectors, sometimes rules are created which are serving rent-seeking elites, and sometimes the lack of rules and the creation of, the definition of corruption, for example, around something like shifting cultivation could be defined as illegal. So the definition of different rules may be a good thing. So I think it's a very contested, those two terms are very contested in my sectors, and I'm trying to apply this discussion to that. Do you want me to go on further? I'll leave it to you. Thank you.
Hi. Who wants to respond to that?
Let me have a shot at it very briefly, because this is a very important and big question, which touches on the issue of legal versus illegal rent seeking, on which I have a book, and I could talk for a long time. As you well know, there are two definitions of corruption. One is based on public officials breaking rules for their own interest, which doesn't cover the issues that you are interested in, which is what about the rules being made by the powerful to serve their interests. And so there's a second definition, which is when the powerful violate, when the powerful use their power, their entrusted power, for their own benefit and against the public benefit. That's corruption. Now that is more difficult to operationalize, because you have to have a very clear conception of what is the public benefit. And you have to have a very clear conception of who makes that judgment. So there are clear cases of state capture. For example, in the last government in Bangladesh passed laws which allowed it to, for example, give power contracts without competition to their cronies. This was completely legal. Okay, so is that corruption? Well, you can say the passing of that law was corruption, but the granting of this maybe not. It was certainly against the public interest, and by that definition, it is corruption. But what we are finding is, even if you don't go into all this definitional debate, when you look at what actually happened in those contracts, the way they were awarded, there was so much conventional corruption going on that you don't need to dispute the definition. We can target them with any definition of corruption you want to use. So at a practical level, it probably doesn't matter, because the bureaucrats who were then granting those contracts to the cronies were taking massive amounts of money as well. Not only was the law being made to enable this, but there was also conventional corruption. I think the problem only arises in the extreme case where, let's say you have some autocratic ruler of a small oil state and there's no democracy, and they pass rules which basically means that the whole country belongs to them. What do you do then? I think the definitional debate comes at those extreme points of state capture, where the state, the individual, and the party become one. But in most of the countries we are discussing, actually, it's not, it's clear what's corruption by any definition. And then we just look at how to stop it in terms of an enforcement process, which is not working because the enforcement process itself is corrupted. Then how do you get the horizontal checks to make that work? I don't know if that answers your question, because it's a really profound question at another level. I think that the examples we are discussing would fall under any definition of corruption.
Yeah, thank you. I won't hog the space now, but I think it's also very interesting in terms of, I work a lot on the responses, which I guess is what you're leading to, and how some of the mechanisms which are to respond to corruption themselves become co-opted, and the devil is often in the details. So it's in the exact standards that the auditors might be, if you're talking about horizontal checks, that the auditors might be using. So those sort of details. Anyway, we can talk about this forever, but it's very interesting, and I'm getting a lot from your framework. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. Yeah, just to encourage people, if they have kind of thoughts and reflections, please either raise your hand and we can come to you to ask a question or share your reflection. But Brendan, you had a question about the kind of relative effectiveness of accountability mechanisms and how the approach takes that into account. Do you want to come in on that?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
It was largely, I think, addressed in talking through the case studies and the diagrams, which I found very helpful. But I'm thinking in particular of the context of Guatemala, where I am presently, where while there is systemic and policy distorting corruption in a number of sectors, there's also a relatively reformist government with a relatively reinvigorated set of kind of vertical anti-corruption kind of efforts, particularly a National Anti-Corruption Commission, which is working to propose kind of improved kind of legal frameworks, but be also engaged in supporting multiple actors to do some of the kind of on the ground monitoring of public resources. But I see that it is looking at the diagram right in front of us on Nigeria and the previous discussion on the Bangladesh case. It's incorporated in kind of how to understand the role of horizontal checking, but also potentially how to buttress and enforce it, but also the role of horizontal checking in supporting those vertical accountability efforts. So it seems like it's all kind of taken into account. I didn't quite catch that from the initial description, but yeah, it came out in the case studies. But happy for more thoughts from Mushtaq or Pallavi on that.
So I think this is the issue of vertical and horizontal is a bit like these Russian dolls, which are one inside the other. So to get your horizontal checks going, you also need some formal policies to support it. Those formal policies might in turn be corrupted, and then you need some more horizontal checks. I mean, in a sense, what we are talking about are societies where the norm is formal behavior and norm is rule-by behavior, because the powerful in general don't want to follow the rules, right? So we are really trying to patch together pockets of solutions to allow some more development of productive activities, because that's the only long-term strategy of actually improving the distribution of power. So nothing that we do in this kind of situation is going to be so watertight that there's a clear-cut answer. We are trying to build answers out of very leaky vessels by trying our best to construct some kinds of checks and balances, which takes us forward. I think that is the best way to look at it, right? And I think that in that sense, for example, in Bangladesh now, we have a situation where, again, there's a lot of stress on the vertical enforcement, catching the thieves, et cetera, but it's actually not making much progress, because the very investigative agencies that are supposed to be doing this are stuffed full of people from the previous regime who themselves have lots to hide, and therefore they're deliberately not going after these people and corrupting the cases with false information. Now, how do you do that? How do you address that? Well, you have to build in as many horizontal checks on the vertical process itself, not only on, so the process itself needs to be checked, and we are working quite hard on trying to do some of that. But it's a moving battle, right? It's a moving battle where really powerful forces are trying to capture the rents, and you have to be really careful because they can knock you off and they can hurt your researchers and they can hurt. So we have to be very practical, realistic, and feasible in terms of what is the bottom-up approach which makes a difference without getting us all killed. I think that's really important to understand, that we are doing something very, very difficult. And if we make some tentative progress, we should all celebrate and have parties and, sing songs, because you're not supposed to succeed. Everything is against you. But the point is not to get depressed and not to think of simple answers and not to have, standard cookie cutter approaches, because that is definitely going to fail. What might not fail is really smart, clever approaches which understands the political economy, the political settlement, the ethnography, and then find solutions which make things work. And what I find heartening is that things are working. Not everything is corrupt. So even in the most corrupt countries, lots of things are working. And if you look at why they are working, you will find there are horizontal checks operating there because some actors really want them to work. And what we are saying is really we need to start from there. I'll stop there.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Mushtaq. I just wanted to pose a question for all of you online rather than the panelists. There've been a number of questions that come up in the chat around has this been applied in X country or Y country or this region or that region? And I was just wondering the extent to which you can see how this kind of approach could be applied in the context and countries and sectors that you're working in. And does this kind of approach resonate with some of the approaches that you're already using in your work? Anybody fancies responding to that question? I'll let people kind of reflect on that for a moment, but Catherine, do you want to come in?
I think I just wanted to note about the horizontal forces that you talked about there, and I think where we are in Papua New Guinea, we haven't reached that tipping point where there's enough, the strength of the horizontal actors can actually impact what's being done vertically. So I don't think we've tried any of those approaches yet, but it's definitely interesting because I've done political economy and political settlements, but having this new sort of framework to further analyze what could be done to strengthen those horizontal actors. Yeah. Thanks. Over.
So in Papua New Guinea, you might be more at the stage of creating those horizontal checks rather than enhancing them. But I think that you will be, I think one way to start looking at it is to ask, does anything work in Papua New Guinea? And I'm sure the answer is nothing works. It can't be, right? So look at the things and once you investigate them, you will find your horizontal checks working, right? So I think the way to work is not to say, where can I find the horizontal checks? The way to start is by saying, what are the things that work reasonably well in Papua New Guinea? Let us try to look at those processes and ask, why do they work at all? And I'm sure you will find your horizontal checks.
Yes, thank you. I think we've probably been more focused on finding the champions, for examples of positive deviance. So who are our good MPs, our good politicians, and what have they championed? So I think this is a different way to approach it. So thank you for that.
It is totally different. Please don't ask a champion, are you a good guy and are you a champion? They will all say yes. Look at their behavior. Is your champion really behaving in a way that a champion should? Find out what they do in their business. Find out what they're doing in their political activities. Find out how they run their party. You might find your champion is someone you should avoid. So I think the problem of finding champions is a very shallow approach to political economy in many cases. Unless you're sure that your champion is embedded in real processes where they have their own interest, and they have the power to do something. That should be your champion. But I think most people don't go so.
So very quickly, Catherine, I think the champions approach, it's a complementary approach, and it's something that we want to take the PCI framework, to the next level. That's pretty much where we are going. So how do you then map a champion's PCI? Because champion is also working with other actors, not in isolation. So doing that analysis becomes the next step. But I very quickly wanted to respond to Vincent's question, which is a really good question. And Vincent, on the point of Nigeria, it's not easy. We took several sessions on something like this with our partners. But in terms of finding, some of the, you mentioned the resource flows, data collection strategies for policy resource flows. That is something that's quite publicly available. The Nigeria work that we are talking about, you just need to do a scan of credible media. You need to do some deep dive key informant interviews and focus groups. This is where qualitative work becomes extremely important. So you can then map where the resource flows are, and then you can triangulate, because no one's going to tell us that, this is where money has gone out and this is how it has been used. But using these different methods and speaking to a wider cross-section of people allows you to triangulate. And then in Nigeria, our second step then was, once we identified the SMEs as a level of entry, that's when we went in with a scoping study, again, a very rich qualitative scoping study, which then fed into the design of the lab in the field. So it's a very nested, intensive process, and comes by 1, 2, 3, and it's not particularly intuitive. It is very informed, but we'll be happy to talk more about it. But at the first level, yes, definitely secondary sources, different methods like KIIs, focus groups, and then designing for a more intensive evidence-based approach. I hope that sort of answers your question. We're happy to go to it later.
Okay, brilliant. Lucio, you had your hand up and then you've lowered it again.
Yeah, because I think my question was very similar to this one. So thank you, Pallavi, for responding that one. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. Mushtaq, you just wanted to...
I just want to add something here, which is that we are abbreviating a lot of stuff in this short presentation. When we say observe, it doesn't just mean that we train people to observe. We also train them to ask questions, but we triangulate, right? So the point that every actor in that system is going to give their own narrative based on their own interest and their own distortions and lies and exaggerations and omissions. So you will get a narrative from a politician which will say, the fault is all with these businessmen and the bureaucrats and we can't control them. The bureaucrat will say, the politicians are corrupt, they force us to do these things, and the businessmen are corrupt. And the businessmen will say the other two, right? So you collect as much information from them as you can with as much detail as they're willing to give to you about the others. They'll never give stories about themselves. Then you start your observation, right? You actually see which story, which triangle, and then you slowly triangulate that, and you construct a description of the PCI of those actors. But a really important source of information actually comes from these interviews and in-depth talking to the people on the scene, knowing that no single individual or perspective is going to give you the full picture. So the training is really there, is to talk to these multiple nodes in that activity, and then build up our own. And we spend a lot of time going through these contradictory stories and saying, this can't be true. If that is true, well, what's the truth? And then we take a third story and a fourth story and a fifth story. And suddenly something begins to emerge. So that is also part of that story, which we didn't have time to go into.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Mushtaq. I'll just hand over to Alan, who has a few kind of forward-looking thoughts, reflections. So over to you, Alan.
Are you showing the slide, Duncan? Sharing the slide?
I will indeed. There you go.
Cool. Thank you very much. Yeah, so just to close things off, I mean, the reason for doing this guide, and we invested a lot of time in doing it together, the reason for doing it was to enable people to engage, to help people to engage with the SOAS ACE approach, and to get their heads around it, and to think about whether it's something that they could use, and to make constructive criticisms of it as well. And I think I'm certainly encouraged by the conversation we've had today. The guide has helped that engagement. As you might have seen in chapter 6, the final chapter, that talks about action, learning and impact and things, kind of different streams of work that might build on the guide. So it talks about supporting practice. So the SOAS ACE team is interested in working out how they can kind of support organisations and initiatives that are putting the SOAS ACE approach into practice. Also interested in facilitating learning, so creating opportunities for collaborative learning amongst organisations who are trying to apply the SOAS ACE approach, and also, I think this is very important, with related approaches that are taking slightly different or maybe very different approaches to trying to address corruption and complex social challenges. We think there will be benefits for all from that kind of two-way collaborative learning. Finally, we hope that the guide and the SOAS ACE approach can increasingly inform discussions, policy discussions about how to address complex social challenges, about supporting tailored governance reforms, and about the role, which might be a quite limited and specific role, of external reactors in supporting locally led development. So we're hopeful, the team is hopeful that the SOAS ACE approach and guide will contribute to that. And I very much look forward to keeping in touch with many of you and seeing what's possible and what's useful in this regard. And on that, I will pass back to Mushtaq and Pallavi to close things off.
No, I just want to say that we hope we can stay in touch. The whole point of this guide was to take the SOAS ACE approach beyond SOAS ACE. And as I said, we are now at the phase where we are looking at taking the policy ideas into practice and working in a number of projects on that, particularly in Bangladesh. But we hope that there will be some broader interest to take this kind of approach, not just into the identification of policy, but the second step, which is taking the idea into implementation. Over to you, Pallavi.
I think what's very exciting about this framework and approach, and I hope it kind of appeals to you similarly, is we are all used to hearing that context matters. And I think what the PCI framework tells us is how does that context matters and what do you do with that knowledge that you get? Because context matters has become passé. We need to move on and see how do we make that context work for us, and also talks to that eternal divide between is it structure or is it agency, and that's exactly that approach of, do we go to champions? Do we look at the PCI framework? But I think these two now need to talk to each other because this tells us how structure matters and where agency can fit in. I think that's also, we'd like to think is a contribution to this whole debate and make the conversation richer going forward. So thank you everyone for listening, and we'd really love to have your comments later.
Brilliant. Well, thanks to all our speakers today. Thanks for all the participants. Thanks for the insightful comments and questions. And yeah, look forward to being in contact with you in the future and hopefully collaborating on something exciting. So thanks again. Take care.
See ya. Take care, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.